Thank you all. Julia, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Graham. And hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome. My name is Julia Craggle. I'm the Global Safeguarding Advisor at the Leprosy Mission International, and I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Bond Safeguarding Steering Group. So the steering group is really excited today to share this fifth and final skills mapping session. The skills mapping sessions were developed in response to a listening exercise that we carried out in February 2023 with the aim of hearing from smaller organisations about how Bond could better meet their needs. We focused on smaller organisations because we recognise that they maybe face challenges in their safeguarding that are quite different from those faced by larger organisations. And we felt that understanding the challenges would be the first step to finding solutions. The 5 skills mapping sessions have been based on themes that emerged from the listening exercise. The themes that were covered in the first 4 sessions included how to embed safeguarding culture with an organisation, being incident ready, supporting the emotional well-being of safeguarding practitioners, and tailoring training that's the right fit for your organisation and the resources available. And if you missed any of those sessions or you want to listen again, the recordings are available from Bond. So the final theme that emerged was about working on safeguarding with partners. And firstly, there was recognition that safeguarding in partnerships is often top-down and compliance-focused. And the compliance terminology used by many donors and international NGOs can sometimes be off-putting, and it can sometimes make it seem as if partners have no safeguarding in place at all, while the reality is that they almost certainly have measures in place to protect people from harm and abuse. They may just not be using technical safeguarding language to describe this. And secondly, we recognise that for many reasons, partners and their programme participants often face serious barriers to raising safeguarding concerns. So today's presentations will focus on how we can move from mistrust to a shared conversation in our partnerships. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, who all come from Oxfam Great Britain. Anya Gabon is the Safe Programming and Accountability Lead at Oxfam GB, and Rosie Walcott is Head of Safeguarding. Anya and Rosie will be talking to us about barriers to reporting misconduct, power, intersectionality, and context. Dominic Vickers is the UK Partnerships Advisor, and Jan Bouwman is a partnership broker with Oxfam GB. Dominic and Jan will be talking about moving beyond compliance and reimagining partnership. So a big welcome to all 4 of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. And without further ado, I will hand over to Anya and Rosie.
Thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate you and the amazing introduction. If it's helpful, maybe everybody coming from Oxfam Great Britain today can just say a quick hi, just so I don't monopolize the beginning. So if it's okay, can I hand over to Rosie and then pick whoever you want next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. My name's Rosie. I'm Head of Safeguarding Oxfam GB based in the UK. I'll hand over to Dominic.
Hi, everybody. Really pleased to be with you today. I'm Dominic Vickers. I work as a UK Partnerships Advisor in the UK Government Funding Team in Oxfam GB. And I'm going to hand over to Jan.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here. It's a pleasure, actually, because I didn't know I was going to be here till last week, because we're talking about a project that I'm working on, which has safeguarding in it, but it's not fully related to safeguarding. So I was really excited to be part of this conversation and show you what we're doing, and then hearing your feedback on this. So back to Anya, and yeah, talk later.
Sounds beautiful. So I'm going to start us off, and then Rosie will supplement, and then you'll get a beautiful segue, hopefully, into Jan and Dom. But basically, we're going to start by talking us into a project that we have at Oxfam Great Britain on barriers to reporting. So I guess I should start with a general framing as to why we came about this project. We were working on a big kind of community feedback project at the time called Your Word Counts. that sought to better understand how we hear from people, hear from communities specifically, and what were the most effective ways to do so. And what we ended up finding is by building trust through accountability, we ended up hearing a lot of misconduct. And so we asked ourselves, why is it that survivors, so survivors here I'm using as a general catch-all term to include those who have experienced misconduct, which at Oxfam is anti-fraud and corruption, as well as safeguarding. But obviously focusing a bit more on safeguarding during this conversation. But why is it that survivors who've experienced sexual exploitation, harassment, and abuse felt that they would prefer using programmatic channels, so community listening, as opposed to our big formal listening mechanisms? So they've shifted in time as a result of this project. But back in the day, why would they prefer speaking to somebody face to face as opposed to using a hotline or an email address? And that sparked 3 pieces of research. So we can go to the next slide, please. So those pieces of research happened in Iraq, Ghana, and Myanmar. And the research essentially sought to better understand why it was that survivors preferred certain ways to report and what it was that they had to face in order to even be able to report to us. We chose 3 different contexts, and they're different both in terms of geography, but also in terms of how Oxfam works in those environments. So Iraq, we saw a mixed kind of implementation. So what we call direct implementation, which is Oxfam staff members doing what it is that we speak about doing, and partner-led, so working with others to do the things that we say that we're doing. So Iraq had both. Ghana, Oxfam in Ghana was predominantly partner-led, but also a more traditional development context as opposed to a direct humanitarian kind of modality. And Oxfam in Myanmar was Kachin, which was predominantly partner-led and humanitarian. So you can see we were kind of testing ourselves as to how and where people speak to us and the different contexts in which they do so. What then came about was 3 pieces of research, which we can link later. But essentially, the research pointed out several different factors, which I'll go into in a second. And following that, we then realized that how we did the research and how we did the listening perhaps didn't have as gender transformative of a lens as we would have liked. So what that meant is we treated everybody that we heard from as the same, rather than understanding how power plays a role in how people come to us and speak to us and interact with one another, which led to the meta-analysis. Then we brought everybody together and we developed 3 sets of pilots, or 2 sets of pilots in Iraq and Ghana. But for now, I'll take you to the next part of the story. Next slide, please. So these are some of the examples of the barriers that were identified. We have 3 different categories here: personal, interactional, and structural. I'll just pick out some of the pieces to demonstrate what it was that came about in the research. You'll see shame, for example. Now, these barriers range from, I would say, more concrete, tangible, fixable, if that makes sense, barriers, things like awareness. So I'm unable to come to somebody and report what's happened to me because I don't actually know how it's supposed to work. I don't know who I'm supposed to go to. I don't know where I'm supposed to go. I don't know what language I'm supposed to use. And generally speaking, I just don't know how it works. You could see how awareness would be a bit more concrete, tangible, in how we would address that. Something like shame, although on the personal side of things, you can see it has massive repercussions, both in terms of norms, gender, how people are perceived, view others, as well as kind of the social structure we work in. You can see shame, patriarchy, gender norms, how women view themselves, also outcomes that we don't necessarily always agree with on marriage, that sort of thing, all link into shame and become a bit less difficult to address head on. We saw different factors that came about in different contexts and those that came across pretty much all of them. You'll see awareness, shame, resignation, trust, access pretty much come across all of them. Community resolution is a really important one that we noticed as well. And we'll speak to a bit more of that when we get to the pilots. But all of these barriers in all of their complexity and simplicity almost, I can go into a bit after, but I'm going to keep us going if that's okay. So, how did we put into practice some of the barriers that we just saw? You can see how something like awareness would be a bit more straightforward. Community engagement, community listening, awareness sessions, face-to-face engagement, discussions with partners, with people we work with, an ongoing kind of communication basis, printing materials, designing materials to be as relevant to as specific of a context as possible. But how do we address something like that at the same time as we address shame, for example? So Iraq and Ghana decided to explore how to make this operational. So how do you put this into actual practice in a slightly different way? The first thing I want to highlight about that is each of these teams, on the basis of the research and the barriers identified, completely designed this process themselves. So it was very much designed by the teams who actually worked together across different backgrounds. So we had one of the Oxfam and Ghana leaders, Samuel, came from a meal background. He worked really closely with Lydia, who actually came from a human resources background. In the Iraq team, the protection team worked with the meal team, worked with the gender team, worked with others. So you could see how working together and across silos and beyond our boxes became really important. Something to highlight about each of them, Oxfam and Iraq had a strong kind of focus on mitigating survivor shaming, so the aspect of shame. And Oxfam and Ghana had a dual approach of working at a national level to address issues like shame, resignation, through campaigns against gender-based violence and linking through that, but also on community awareness and engagement and kind of demystifying what it was that we were speaking about when we were talking about reporting. Next slide, please. So just some quick what we learned. I could speak about this all day, but we do not have all day. So you'll see on the left-hand side, first and foremost, some of the posters that I alluded to. So on the left, we've got a survivor demonstrating all the different ways in which we tend to blame, especially women when they come forward and report. And it's ways to work with the survivor, not against them, so we can all work together. The Oxfam and Iraq team worked with community leaders, religious authorities. They worked with women's rights organizations, women's leaders in all their kind of diversity to work on survivor shaming. Oxfam and Ghana worked across different forms of intersectionality. You'll see here a poster on inclusion with people with disabilities. And both of them developed signage that worked in all the specific languages. I believe Oxfam and Ghana produced up to 14 different types of posters based on language. But some of the big things in terms of learning that I just want to highlight in the context of this conversation. It's the idea that our survivors do not fit neatly into our boxes. We might think that somebody might prefer to come to us in this one way and then have a resolution in this one way and then be done in this one way. But people are not like that. It is for us to adapt our boxes to others, to be able to really, truly be survivor-centered in what it is that we do and how we are. I think that's something I'm most proud of, especially learning from Rosie's team on how survivor-centered Oxfam has become and stepped into and are actively trying to be. Something to point out too is the importance of decolonization and racial justice. And what I mean when I highlight those two terms is I already spoke to the diversity of language and inclusion, but it's a bit further than that. It's understanding how something like the historical settings and contexts in which we speak about are not inherently neutral and are not catch-all categories in the same way that all of us and everywhere that we sit within multiple identities and multiple issues and within the context of the world that we live in. So too do our safeguarding systems. And so it's a constant need to adapt and learn what it is that we're doing. And on the decolonization, it's that our systems and processes need to be ready and adaptable to people and to the power systems that they exist within. So when we're doing the research now, we're on to the next phase, hopefully, we'll see that we tend to do the research for every single different area of power that we see represented, because authority shifts and changes based on how power manifests. Next slide, please. Really quickly, some recommendations. The first one is the big standard, always golden one that we always speak about, and that I'm sure my colleagues Jan and Dom will speak to extensively, the importance of flexible and adaptable funding, and the link here to decolonizing risk. It is so imperative that we're able to adapt our programming based on, as I was mentioning, the power structures that we see, but also that which we experience on a daily basis. And then another quick point here is on confidentiality and community resolution. I did say I would come back to those two. Those are two that we're still actively trying to unpick, not in terms of the importance of working with and through community resolution, and again, not with and through the importance of confidentiality, but how that is perceived, felt, and integrated within our programming on a daily basis. So from community resolution, oftentimes we see things as a binary almost, that we either work with community or we work against it. And you could see, if applied through kind of a gender justice lens, we are either seen as working with community and therefore maybe losing out on some of our values when it comes to feminist practice. I mentioned marriage with perpetrators as an outcome that was seen as preferred because survivors wanted to opt into a system they knew the outcome of. And so Oxfam were scratching our heads, oh, do we work with this or against it? And instead, what we've decided to do is take a look at the long history of community leadership and mobilization and activism that already exists within different contexts, working on gender justice, women's rights. Find our allies, find people that we can learn from better on some of this, and then work towards an outcome that community members would prefer and survivors would prefer. Final point on reparative justice. Obviously, a perceived lack of justice as a result of an outcome is seen as a barrier. Why would I report to something if I feel like it's not going to work out in a just way? And so we're trying to work out different ways in which we can integrate community perceptions of justice into that which we do on programming. I've spoken a lot. Over to you, Rosie. And next slide, I should say.
Thanks, Anya. Yeah, you've touched on obviously some key safeguarding points there. But yeah, thank you. The report, the project, so it's been a joint safeguarding, safe programming project from the outset. And I was fortunate to come into it, I don't know, a year and a half ago, something like that. So the project's entirely designed and managed in country, as Anya said, and then that's given that knowledge, contextual awareness, of safeguarding issues in Iraq and Ghana, and that's evident in the way that programs are and safeguarding is embedded in the programs. So yeah, the evidence base from this project, it supports safeguarding goals in OGB and across the Confederation. It's kind of more than a project. It's a stance, contextualized intersexual feminist safeguarding. Some reflections, safeguarding reflections from the report. Touched on already. Obviously, resourcing is always going to be up there. SEAH is a reality. It's a risk that requires resources to mitigate it. In prevention and response, and especially in survivor support. Partners, working with partners, often the best organisations or individuals to be able to provide that support. And budgeted flexible funding, which is one of the recommendations. Is seen and proven to have been effective, and as I said, a recommendation for this project for future programs, all future programs, hopefully one day. The focal point model is mentioned in the report. Most organisations have a safeguarding focal point network. We've recently reviewed Oxfam's focal point model, and basically it's here to stay. It's a valuable resource in prevention, but also, as anything, needs to be evolved and adapted over time. We want to move away from staff members doing 100% of their role and volunteering on another 20% basis, which we don't agree with, and safeguarding should be properly embedded into all roles, and safeguarding responsibility lying within the organisation and not just on focal points. Survivor support we've talked about a bit, and linked into that as reporting mechanisms, as Anya said, need to be understood in contextualized and in conjunction with community justice and community resolution systems as well. They're very much interlinked. Someone's preferred route to report and is linked to what they understand the outcome and what's going to happen to that information when they do, even if they don't agree with what that outcome might be. It's still seen as the safest option. So multiple reporting mechanisms is what we advocate for. I think that's me for this slide. I do have to rush off, unfortunately. So if you have safeguarding questions related to the project, got my name, feel free to drop me a line anytime.
Thank you so much, Rosie. 10 out of 10 recommend reaching out and speaking to Rosie. She's an incredible wealth of knowledge and resource. But to really quickly wrap this up, so where we're at now is trying to figure out a way to work with different teams on different modalities of different pieces of this based on what it is that they have an interest and are already working on. Interestingly, we're working with Oxfam in Yemen on a partner-led model for reparative work, linking some of the gender-based violence work, as well as some of this broader work on community perceptions of justice. We've worked with Oxfam in South Sudan on a pilot about how we do ongoing survivor support, as well as identifying barriers in 4 different locations within UI and PBOR. And we worked on a big workshop on program design as to what a next stage of this could look like with different teams, including Oxfam Bangladesh, and Oxfam in Jordan as well. So please stay tuned. We will share any and all learning and all the challenges known as soon as we get them. So that's us on that one. Back over to you. I'm not sure. I hand over to Dom, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Anya and Rosie. So moving along into our discussion, I'm now dealing with the next 3 items, which is bringing us back a bit, I think, to look at what the problem with compliance is, and then what we learned at Bond from the sector, mainly from a workshop and other things that we did last year, and then turning towards Oxfam's internal and external commitments. Because as we'll see, I think, unless we address our attitudes to race and colonialism, then we can't begin the transformation that makes this compliance regime change. And finally, Jan will talk about reimagining partnerships. So could I have the next slide, please, Graham? Thank you. I don't know whether you want to just keep pressing them. They're sort of separate bullet points. So first of all, what is the problem with compliance? Well, first of all, they're built on colonial and racist assumptions that basically fundamentally mistrust local organizations and says that INGOs are trustworthy, that anything in the south is risky or suspicious. And the way the risk is framed is about the risk to the donor, or it can be risk to the reputation of the INGO. But actually, the risk we should be talking about is that owed to the community. So when we're talking about safeguarding, I would have a very different perspective if I was thinking about it just as a donor or as an INGO, or more differently, if it was my family that was at risk. So it's just about us rethinking about risk, about who it's owed to. Are we just thinking about reputation, or are we really focused on the community itself? It's also a deficit approach. So it lists how partners do not match up to the expectations and patterns of INGOs. It sort of judges them by an INGO standard. It sort of universalizes the concerns and approaches of the North on metrics that work really, really well for INGOs, but not so well for partners. And that also means that instead of starting by saying, well, why do we want to work with partner organizations? Well, they're rooted in the community, they have legitimacy, they're the first to respond, they know what they're doing, they're the most capable and effective instruments of change, and they operate in a sustainable way. That's where we should be starting, and then we should be looking at other issues, not in that sense. And the report I've sort of stuck on the top is the rapid review of the Ukraine response. And what I've lifted out there on the top is this quote from it, which says that 100 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, why are INGOs sitting on millions of pounds and local volunteer groups are running out of cash? And the answer was because all the agencies were doing multiple due diligence assessments of the same organizations, or the organizations were too small or to cope with the bureaucratic kind of mountain they had to climb to get funding. And that situation brought that out into the open. Next slide, please, Graham. Thank you. Oh yeah, the last thing there, sorry, you can flick over, but the last thing is that it leaves INGOs in a risk sandwich. So many of us are absorbing risks from donors and then trying not to spread those further down onto the partners, which is a kind of good thing, but it does cause nightmares, obviously, for CEOs and finance officers and so on in the INGOs, because it can be quite unsustainable. So this slide is a sort of summary slide of a session that we did at Bond last year, which some of you may have been to. I put a little link in the chat to a blog I wrote, which is a very short summary, but you can also find a link there to watch the seminar if you want. And we heard from, these are different ideas from people around the sector about how we could look at this issue of compliance with partner organizations. And Start Fund, we're talking about localizing due diligence, so using obviously local materials in local languages and having local assessors, but also respecting local standards. In a lot of countries, say like Nepal, has accountancy standards for non-profit organizations. And so the first step of any sort of donor or anybody assessing compliance should be saying, well, are you compliant with those local standards? Because if so, we're fine. So it's also about building on what already exists. And then I think a lot of people have talked about due diligence passporting. So the idea there is that once you're qualified for one situation, you can then be qualified again. Start Fund do that a little bit with DEC and Start Fund. But we do have that ridiculous situation, don't we, where partners can be linked to an NGO with the same donor, and then they're applying for funding again. They have to go through exactly the same processes. So we need to find a way around that. And then trust works both ways, doesn't it? Because INGOs have shown themselves not to be totally trustworthy. And Start Fund has an idea about amalgamating everybody's due diligence process and then enabling with permission any partner organization to look up a UK INGO's due diligence assessment and see for themselves how they came out. But I think this is a deeper question, and Jan will come on to this. But it's very easy in a kind of conventional, mistrustful way to assume that the fault lies always with the partner. And instead of assessing partners, we should be assessing our partnerships, our relationships with partners. So when we're thinking about, say, the possibility of frauds or safeguarding, we're looking at all those things, we should be thinking about what do each of us bring to this partnership, and where are our strengths and weaknesses, and where do we all need training and support where there are gaps. And that way, I think we think a bit differently about the risks to a particular program. Because you know, in a football match, if a team lets in a goal, it could be the goalie's fault. It could be that they're absolutely terrible. But most likely it's because everybody else in the line has actually let that ball through. So to what extent are we thinking about, say, an incident around fraud or safeguarding or anything as our joint responsibility, as an open, mutually accountable relationship where we eradicate those things by understanding how we are approaching those risks as a partnership. And then we also heard from the Community Fund. So the lottery are, you know, quasi-governmental bodies. They're answerable to governments. They're quite strict rules on how they spend their money. But their local field officers work with communities to explore with them how they're standing, what their risks are. And then they only ask them for further information on the areas that they're not happy with them, rather than getting them to submit lots and lots of documents all at once. And in a different experiment, the Center for Disaster Preparedness in the Philippines, which is a partner of Global Giving and funded by USAID, was looking at a program where it was trying to encourage applications from the tiniest organizations. And obviously they did things in local languages and had simple forms and so on, but they also encouraged applications by video. And then they, very similar to the Community Fund, they then spent time with those partners in a sort of getting to know you process to work out how that partner was structured and what sort of funding it could absorb and so on. Can I have the next slide, please, Graham? Thank you. So there were a number of observations from this, and one of them was around, I think, putting the partner at the center of the ecosystem. So rather than seeing the project or the program as the sort of main focus, if you have the partner at the center and then the donors and the NGOs supporting it and so on are all part of that process to support the partner. And understanding the ecosystem allows you to see what community assets are available too. Mike Mercado of CDP talked about sweat equity, and that's the ability of a partner organization to draw local support and volunteer action and resources and so on. Something that's very much underestimated and not on the balance sheet, but very much present in the capacity of the partner. And that also helps the decisions on how much funding that partner should have, because too much funding could harm the partner and harm the aspirations of the local community. And so it makes us more sensitive, I think, to supporting partners to really grow and thrive in the direction they want to do. And lastly, there was a discussion about that the work was involving trying to reduce the compliance requirements of USAID in relation to these small partners. They managed to get rid of 51 of the compliance requirements down to 1. But very much an experimental stage, but a real sign, I think, the sector is shifting quite dramatically on this. Next slide, please. So, thank you. So I think, as we've been saying, this isn't just a paper exercise. It is about all of us shifting our imaginations and shifting our views and attitudes in order to create greater transformation in the area of risk and compliance. Oxfam itself has this decolonial partnership strategy, which is about divesting us from racialized and colonial power. And we want to become a partner of choice for our partners. So we want them to choose us, irrespective of any funding or anything. We want them to work with us. And in that basis, we want partnerships to be based on trust and mutual accountability to the partners we work with. But because we're a larger organization, that is also about accountability to our country offices from those of us working in the global north, and also to what we call our southern affiliates. So those are other Oxfams that are national southern organizations in countries around the world. So just rebalancing that relationship. And I put here a quote from our strategy, which is just saying that the colonial belief that the global south is apparently backward and less knowledgeable and riskier has led to inflexible and onerous compliance. Our risk aversion and compliance issues are linked to power. And we need to co-design that to be more people-centered and context-sensitive in the way that Anna was talking about some of the reporting misconduct and so on, and moving from colonial compliance to this accountability piece. And then also externally, many of you will have signed up for the Pledge for Change, and I've lifted out there some that relate to compliance and risk. It calls a more collaborative approach to risk management, and then avoiding stricter risk requirements to our partners than to ourselves, which is a pretty low bar, but it's still an important one. And then minimizing compliance on partners. So next slide, please. Okay, so that's I hope the sort of framework, and I'm now going to hand over to Jan to talk about one particular aspect. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, Dom. Thanks, Anya. Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, everyone, for this opportunity. I'm going to speak a little bit about how we in Oxfam are, we've piloted and developed and piloted a new approach to partnership, and especially partnership assessment. It's called CAPAS, and it wants to be a collaborative and adaptive partnership approach, and links very much to what Dom was saying and also to what Anya was saying before that. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So what is CAPAS? At this point, it's still a proposal to the whole of the Oxfam Confederation for a principled, collaborative and adaptive partnering approach. And when we started, we really started out with that idea of like, we need to find a workable balance between that need for compliance, which is important for accountability, both to our communities and to our donors, but which is very onerous and difficult for local partners very often because it's not adapted. And on the other hand, that's the values that we as Oxfam stand for, the principles that we have, the decolonial partnership strategy that Dom already mentioned. So we have very strong ambitions on what we want to be as an organization, but we get often blocked. There are barriers to actually put that into practice due to how the aid system is organized, the colonial history of it all behind it and stuff. So how do we find a way to combine the two in a sense that works for our country teams and partners? We started off with the partnership assessment approach because that's where we start that relationship. That's where that clash is most strong. That's where we do the due diligence and we start and step into that relationship with partners directly from that very colonial top-down kind of way of working. But we realized very quickly that we need to do this across the partnership cycle, because once you start a different conversation, you cannot go back to a top-down kind of conversation later on in the partnership cycle. So here you see the shift that we're really aiming for. It's really to step away, and this is really black and white. So it's really just to show where we want to go. There's already a lot of efforts, that move us in between the two, but just to give a clear idea of the shift that we want to make. We present it like this. We move away from a very top-down, a very disempowering assessment or an audit of a partner where we manage the partner, right, to a much more collaborative and co-created approach where we're aware of the power dynamics, where we address the power dynamics, and that we create a much more equitable relationship from the start. And it's, as Dom was already saying, it's not about assessing the partner, it's about assessing and managing the partnership as a collective. So it's moving away from that compliance and risk-oriented approach that we currently use to also looking at what are the opportunities in taking risks. So what are the real risks involved, and what are the opportunities if we don't take those risks? So balancing those two out much more than we currently do. So moving away from the mistrust and the control and the upwards accountability where the whole system is based on to mutual accountability, building trust, and understanding compliance, not as we have to follow the rules, but what is good practice, and compliance is good practice for impact. It's not just following a rule that somebody has put in at some point. And the third really important element that we want to change is to step away from that one size fits all. We have this list of due diligence questions or what an organization should look like, and we apply that to all the different partners in all the different contexts. And we really need to contextualize and make an adaptable kind of approach. But how do you do that in practice, right? So how do we make that step? So what CAPAS really offers here is guidance and tools and templates for our teams and the partners to really have those kind of conversations and start that relationship in a complete different way. And it provides a tier system with an overview of what minimum requirements could look like for different types of relationships and different kinds of partners that we work with. But I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Next slide, please. So it really is about looking at the principles, the Oxfam values, the feminist principles, the partnership principles, and how we do partnership is not about, all the rules that we have and all the things that you need to think of and the processes. It's you as a person who steps into a partnership, basing yourselves on those values and principles, then step into that relationship and adapt and follow those principles when you set that up. So it's about a continuous partnership assessment and learning approach across the cycle that focuses on the collective. It's not an audit of a partner to say, how good are you? Are you achieving the Nordic kind of standards of what due diligence looks like? It's about we as a partnership, as a collective, how are we going to do this, right? A second point is that we want to change the way we show up in the relationship. From that very top-down kind of way, we want to address the colonial power that sits within the system, within our relationship, within our one-to-one kind of who we are. We're Oxfam, you're a local partner. We address that power and we try to find mitigating measures there. So it's a lot about mindsets, or just as much about mindsets of our staff, to take that approach, as well as our processes and systems that would allow for our staff to take those kind of relationships up. Decision making as well, and this is a key one, I think, is in the hands of those who are in the partnership. So it's not a set of established lists of requirements, that somebody in the north one day has decided. So really the people in the partnership that say what is relevant for us, and we co-create, we adapt based on the relationship that we have. Next slide, please. So what does it look like? It really is, it's not a due diligence approach, right? So it's really a partnership assessment approach. So you have to look at the context that you work in and the context of the partnership. What's the purpose of the partnership? Who are the partners that are involved? What kind of relationships do we have? Is it unrestricted funding? Is it restricted funding? Is it a non-financial relationship? That changes completely the picture and the way that relationship is going to work. We're also thinking about what are the concerns and the risks linked to the context, but also linked to Oxfam. We've had a safeguarding crisis. How does that affect the relationship that we want to have with local partners, and vice versa, right? We have to put those things on the table and not just shove them in the corner and just pretend nothing happens. So we have to look at all these elements and then co-create together with the partner what that partnership process should look like. So how deep are we going to talk about partnership? Is this really just a subcontracting relationship, or are we really talking about a strategic partnership? So that conversation becomes something completely different. The methodologies we use, the topics we include, and even the standards that we require should be very, very different based on each of the relationships that we have. But we also think that, it's not only the process that should be different, it's also the outcomes of that conversation should inform how we set up the partnership. We often still do monthly financial reporting, because then we can keep an eye on, we can do BVAs, and we can control how things are moving forwards. But if a partner, you do an assessment and a partner has very good financial assessment systems in place and works with multiple international NGOs and maybe directly with international donors, why do they have to report to us monthly if we only have to report yearly to our donor? It just doesn't make any sense to have that one size fits all kind of approach. So we really want to make that shift, that our staff and partners sit together, co-create the approach and the process first, and then move into, and what does that look like for our partnership? I'm going to use the example of safeguarding for you. So next slide, please, Graham. So it really is a conversational approach that we want to put in. So it's not an audit, an interrogation, or assessment of one of the partner's capacities, but it's a dialogue to co-create and agree, on the one hand, on the standards that we want to live up to as a partnership. So you see here on the left-hand side, it might be a bit small, but these are the kind of standards that we put in for safeguarding. And this is still very much the colonial kind of way of looking at it. There's still very international kind of good practice standards that are just used in the aid sector. Also, the tier system is still based on, where the risk, financial risks, how higher the amount of money you give, and the stricter the donor, the higher your tier is. So it's still very much based on that colonial system, and we need to take a next step. But this was a way of trying to find that workable balance that I spoke of in the beginning. So we have these commitments and requirements, and it's up to the partnership to decide which of these requirements are actually important to us, right? So it's not the intention to present this and say, oh, this is what is mandatory for Oxfam. The question is at the top. So the question is not, do you have a safeguarding policy? Do you do reference checks? Do you have an investigative capacity and things like that? The question is, how are we as a partnership going to keep people safe? Now, tell me what you already do and how you organize your safeguarding. Then I will tell you what I do and the capacities that I have. And then together we look at, so what is then a reasonable way of doing this together based on existing capacities within the collective? So it really is about, shaping the way we do safeguarding and financial management and misconduct and conflict analysis and sensitivity and influencing, and how we look in civic space and security and safety. All these questions are about how are we as a partnership going to do that? So we really want to make that shift to, are you achieving all these kind of requirements that we want to do? Or no, we don't want to look at that. We want to look at how we as a collective are going to make sure that people are safe. And hopefully that will help Anja's project in, creating much more clarity within the partnership on who does what and when do we use whose reporting mechanisms. Do we have a similar understanding of what survivor-centered approach is? What can we learn from you, and not just based on, oh, but we are the experts, we will tell you what you should do and need to do. So we hope there will be a lot more cross-fertilization between our organizations to do this. So this is where I will stop. And I hand over back to Dom, I think, to finish off. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan. So this was just a last slide, really, looking at the other implications, or the other ways we've been thinking about decolonizing our partnerships. And like many of you who may be doing this already, we're committed to sharing our ICR overheads with our partners proportionate to the percentage of their program delivery in the budget. We also have a women's rights fund, which offers core, flexible, committed funding to very small women's rights organizations to invest, in their own development, and for them to choose where the money goes. And this is also part of this process of us trying to be a better partner, so us to learn how to improve our systems and the way we relate to partners, so that actually we get out of the way and enable them to thrive and become sustainable and growing organizations. And it has led to us simplifying, some of our processes. It's freed up staff and partner time to really spend longer talking about partners' sort of strategic goals and the partnership itself. And obviously CAPAS as an approach really helps us in that discussion. And then lastly, we also have something where we've got called partnership investment funds. We've used small amounts of funding for countries to invest in partners and build them and try and learn from that. So I hope that's provided some kind of structure to show what our thinking has been so far. I know many of you have been involved in similar pieces of work, and I think just talking to Julia, I think you've had similar things going on, and I'm sure you'll want to share that. So very happy to open it up for questions, but also for people to share their own experiences. Many of you will be much further ahead on the road than we are. We were just asked to share what we've been doing. So really interested in what you're doing and what you have to say.
Great, thank you so much, Dom, and thanks, as well to all four of you, to Anya, Rosie, Jan, and Dom. They were really interesting, thought-provoking presentations. I know I've got a million questions now. We do have some time now for our speakers to answer any questions that you have. Rosie did unfortunately have to leave, but Anya, Dominic, and Jan are here to respond to any questions. Also, as Dom said, if you have your own experiences to share, that would also be great. So please feel free to put questions or comments in the chat box, or you can come off mute and speak to us. So yeah, are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to bring to us?
It's Wade Tibbury here. I'm head of safeguarding for Railway Children, a small UK-based charity that works in Tanzania, India, and in the UK. And I was appreciating some of the ideas that Jan was talking about with regards to safeguarding and setting up the safeguarding sort of processes in partnership. So those initial conversations, I can envisage my colleagues in India and Tanzania having those sort of conversations. And I think some of those do, because we talk a lot about capacity building with the partner as part of the due diligence, but also as part of developing the partnership. But I think there are some parts of the organization that would struggle a little bit with there being an absence of audit process to ensure that everything's in its place. And I think as a sort of seasoned safeguarding professional, there's a part of me that would be a little bit anxious about just sort of taking that step back. How would you envisage overcoming that anxiety?
And that's a really good question. And in our piloting, that's what we've noticed, right? So it will take time for the whole organization to be able to take this step, because people don't want to take the risks, right? So they feel uncomfortable in saying, I'm going to let this go, because in this context, like it doesn't matter. And we're talking like unrestricted funding, we're not even talking donor requirements, right? But we're talking safeguarding, we're talking people's lives, right? So what do you keep in? What do you not? If you want to keep everything in, as we do now, we have a list, I think, of 35 safeguarding questions, and you go through a very small community-based women's rights organization in Tanzania, to use like one of your examples, and you have a list of 35, they're going to feel we don't have that, and we will not be capable of having that. And we as Oxfam do not have the capacity to provide that to you. And just giving you a policy on safeguarding is not going to make any difference. But the culture that you already have in your organization, how you already keep people safe, the little things that we can support you with are much more important, but we don't listen to them, right? How we're going to overcome that fear of people just really, going there. What we hear a lot in our country offices that, the due diligence assessment is done by a project officer. Go ask all these questions to a partner, and then we'll see if it's, good enough or whatever. That's not possible if you want to apply this kind of approach. You have to send your safeguarding focal point or a safeguarding manager to have that conversation, who can actually make a decision about what is sufficient, what is not, what do I need, what do I not, where do I see a risk and where not, and who is comfortable to say to the country director who signs off on this, to say, like, I, as a safeguarding manager, have been there, and for me, this are sufficient safeguarding elements here. When I spoke to the safeguarding team, they said the only thing that we really need is that the communities that they work in know that they can report, that there are reporting mechanisms available, and if they don't have any investigative capacity, we step in, right? So it's basically just that. It's the absolute bare minimum of it. Do they need to do reference checks of people? Yeah, would be great, but if they don't have that capacity, that's not the key element. The key element is then reactively being able to do something. That's the first thing. And preventive by doing a lot of community awareness on these things. And that's where we try to put the focus on. But yes, it will take time for people to get used to that. It will take time for partners to get used to having that kind of, I don't need that whole list of things. And it really shows that we need to have the higher level people having these conversations who are comfortable in taking those decisions and having those conversations, because it's not easy, and we're very much aware of that.
Yeah, Anita, go ahead.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, Anita. Lovely to see you.
Good to see you. I'm trying to find the the hands up function, but I can't see it. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Anita Williams. I'm an international safeguarding consultant, and I want to thank Oxfam so much for sharing all your learning regarding your investment in partnerships. I think it's well overdue. So well done. I just wanted to share a little bit, having been around forever, feel a bit like a dinosaur. The whole localization agenda back in the day when we talked about that, I'm sure you're familiar, and how many organizations, I mean, several, almost perhaps 100 or perhaps 200 international NGOs, where Oxfam was in the forefront about signing up Charter to Change or Charter for Change, yes, and how, we could actually use new percentages of how much of our funding was invested in partner organizations and building up partners so that they could themselves obviously put in applications and proposals for and build up their organizations so that they could actually manage some of the hefty work. I'm really pleased that you talked about risk, and I for the longest time thought about the fact that the way that partnership agreements were worded was that we literally putting the entire risk of the implementation of projects on partner organizations when they weren't prepared. And redressing some of these issues was something that Charter for Change did. So that's wonderful. I just wanted to raise the issue about compliance. And we know that obviously the FCDO or any other due diligence processes have been developed with, international NGOs in mind. And there is also the whole principle of proportionality that comes with that compliance. So we wouldn't expect a homegrown community-based organization to be able to comply with the 35 or whatever 50 set criteria. So, the adaptation of those standards are helpful, I think. And this is the work that I've been doing with a lot of partner organizations. So really the suggestion I had was, we know CAPSIA is now been developed and it's out there. So how much work, if any, has Oxfam done about maybe adapting CAPSIA, because it's a common assessment framework for partner organizations, and maybe thinking about doing that in terms of type of organization and or type of project program they may be funded for, thinking through how we can actually use tools which are already out there rather than reinventing the wheel. So thank you so much.
I can just jump in to say probably the best link on that one is to link with Rosie, who's been leading from an Oxfam GB perspective on CAPSIA. So really sorry, but you'll have her email. Please reach out to her. She'll be the best person.
Okay, great. Okay, good to know that you've already thought about it, though. Thank you.
Yes.
Anita, yeah, thank you for, what you were saying about proportionality, and also Charter for Change, but also Pledge for Change as well, where I think, we're trying to set ourselves quite high standards in terms of, as you say, resourcing, but also the voice of people in the South and how they're coming across in how we communicate, and to what extent they're leading in the development of proposals and so on. And that's all really important. So yeah, thank you for that.
If I can just jump in really quickly also on the due diligence passporting here. So there's obviously very difficult to combine CAPAS with due diligence passporting, because what we're doing, it's not a due diligence assessment. It is a partnership conversation, right? So what we're promoting is that in CAPAS, you use due diligence passporting. If in the country due diligence passporting exists, please use that, don't do it again, and things like that. But CAPAS is about having that relationship. How are we going to keep people safe? And you don't read that from a due diligence assessment. So you're still going to have to need the conversation of like, well, I've read your due diligence that you've done with Save the Children, for example. You know, how can we build on that to actually decide together what we want to do? So I think there's still need for that, you know, like a combination of like what already exists. We have standardized like assessments, but still, you know, you need to build a relationship, and so there needs to be a way of combining the two. And that's why our list, it's not a checklist, you know, it's a list of standards that you can look at. It's a guide for you to look at. But if something already exists on safeguarding, please feel free to use that and have that conversation in a completely different way.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Are there any other questions? And also just to point out, there are some really good links being put into the chat by Oxfam and by Anita as well. So yeah, make sure you don't miss those before we finish. I've got this question in the chat from Emma saying, thanks for really interesting presentations. Dominic mentioned a risk sandwich with INGOs in between partners and donors. How do you work with donors to understand the shift you're describing, especially when it's taxpayers' money, so the donor justifies a strong requirement for compliance and being risk averse? Any tips or joint advocacy? Have you seen any shifts?
That's a really good question, and it's something that I'm very engaged with donors and trying to message on. And my hunch is that you know, some of the feedback that Jan got in the CAPAS arrangement was that Ogsam's program staff learnt more than they had done about how things were operating in the context. Isn't that right? So when they had open questions about, well, what's your, how does safeguarding work in your community and how does it work in your organization? They spent more time and had a much greater sense of the context that they were operating in, just because they were spending more time asking the partner about what was happening in their community. And so my argument when I talk to FCDO and various people is always along the lines of, actually, I mean, it's a good thing to do anyway, A. B, I think you're going to lower your risk in the long run if you absolutely know your context. Because if what you're doing is actually integrated with all those reporting mechanisms and so on that Anya talked about, and what's happening locally and local customs and how people understand safeguarding, and you're building on that, then you're going to have a safer operation and a safer way of doing things than one which is a one size fits all standardization. And similarly, I think with risk, and this is the other argument I go on, which I mentioned earlier, which is about if you're viewing the partner as something that you're assessing, and you're not assessing the partnership, which indeed includes the donor as well, then if you understand what we each bring to this in terms of mitigating against risk, then you have a better understanding and a more open relationship that I believe is less likely to have risks and so on attached to it. Because if you have a more open relationship, the likelihood the partner is going to tell you when they're struggling with a particular thing, because there's no consequences from that except a damage to the partnership that they want to keep going. So my hope is that that's true. I feel like, you know, anecdotally it is true. And I don't think a more reflective donor will disagree with something which is more context rich when it comes back from an NGO saying, look, this is our experience. This is what we're saying. This is how we see risk. And this is very much what's happening in this context. So that's my arguments at the moment. I don't think any of them have landed, but that's my lines.
Right, thanks, Dom. I'm going to be cheeky and ask one question of my own, if that's okay. At the Leprosy Mission, I really like your partnership approach, and we're trying to do something similar, maybe a bit less structured at the moment, in terms of making it a partnership conversation rather than a long list of compliance questions. I think what we're finding and listening to you, when you're needing somebody who's your safeguarding focal point to sort of lead those conversations, and I think as Rosie was saying, often, especially for smaller organizations, your safeguarding person is also the HR person and the something else person and the something else person. Is this approach actually quite almost burdensome for your safeguarding points? How do you kind of get around that extra sort of layer of work for your safeguarding stuff?
Do you want me to take that one?
Sure.
Okay, yes. No, it's basically to acknowledge 100% of what you're describing, Julia. And I think one of the key lessons learned that we've learned, both from a safe programming perspective, I mean, you can imagine you're an HR person, you're the anti-fraud and corruption focal point, you're the protection focal point in some contexts, you're also the safe programming focal point and the safeguarding focal point. So you're constantly doing the hat dance. One of the key learnings that we found linked to the focal point structure is the importance and necessity of senior management buy-in in all the different areas in which we work. So be it a modality of an area office or a regional office, it's important to have a kind of contracting process where it's signed on, acknowledged, and built into that person's day-to-day work that X percentage of their time is on this thing A. And it's that ownership too that senior management are then directly accountable for also their time in supporting that person. So it's not just the one person who has to do it all, but also the kind of top team wherever they're sitting that is also linked to and has mandatory objectives. I know for safe programming, for example, so that's the team that I work on. Dom mentioned kind of adaptive risk management and mitigating harm to communities. That's our kind of ballpark. We have a lot to work on and develop in terms of culture change and behavior change. But the biggest thing, yeah, we found is the necessity of basically everybody having some degree of accountability when it comes to what it is that we're describing, rather than, and that in that way, focal points are kind of your trip line or your tripwire or your face-to-face contact rather than holding the entire responsibility for that area in what they do. But yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Anya. And I'm just looking at the time. I think we're coming towards the end of the session. So I'd just like to thank our speakers once again, Anya, Rosie, Jan, and Dominic. Thank you to Bond for hosting this session. I hope you found it useful and interesting. And finally, thank you to all of you for attending. The recording and the slides will be shared with you by an email afterwards.